Mayor TenHaken, we appreciate you sitting down with us and having a conversation. This conversation is going to be very specific about how we move forward, how Juneteenth kind of plays a part with you and your family, how you guys celebrate it. But then also with the recent events that we've had, we wanted to highlight some things that have been going on directly in our city, have impacted the Black community directly in Sioux Falls, and then how we move forward with some action items there. So once again, I appreciate you sitting down talking to us. We're going to keep the conversation short because you're a busy man. But the first question, we just want to jump right into it. With the recent events that we've had going on, how do you really foresee us moving forward?
Well, yeah, thanks. So let me just open by saying the topic of Juneteenth, which is why we're having this conversation, is I have talked to more people in our city and community about Juneteenth, and they usually say, what is that?
Yeah.
So one, I'm glad we're doing this because there's been this elevation of this, I don't want to really call it a holiday, but Day of Remembrance of Juneteenth, that a lot of people in our community have no idea what Juneteenth is.
Right.
And so that aspect alone has been kind of neat to see, and how it's educated people on what happened after the Emancipation Proclamation, and how the slaves were ultimately freed.
Right.
How we move forward in our community is a challenging question, but I also think we in Sioux Falls are set up in a way to make some significant strides and progress, maybe quicker than a lot of other areas in the country. And I think the reason we're set up better is we have a lot of people in our community, people like you. You have a mayor that wants to see, change and inclusivity and diversity on this topic be a part of the conversation. We want to see change. We don't have a big divide in our community.
Yeah.
And so we already start at a point of neutrality, which is very important in something like this. I think a couple specific things, Julian, that we need to do. One is we need to continue to look at our police department and the diversity of our police department. So I'm going to get very granular and say the diversity of our police department needs to improve. We've set a goal internally to have 20% of our department be diverse.
Nice.
By 2022. Now, that's a big lift. That's a big goal. But we can do some things better in terms of our recruiting practices, trying to make our department culture more inclusive and open to people of color wanting to apply. But I'll be honest, being a police officer today and in law enforcement, as is hard. And it's even harder for someone of color.
Right.
And so we're going to work hard on that. The other real specific action item is just this week, I actually worked with my budget team to reallocate dollars to start to fund a diversity, inclusion, and equity position for the city. And not necessarily for the city of Sioux Falls, but maybe it would be in partnership with our chamber, potentially Forward Sioux Falls, so that we actually have a common voice and someone leading these initiatives from the government level in city government.
Right.
That's something we haven't had before historically in the city. So just having someone who wakes up every day going to their work saying, my job today is to focus on making our community more inclusive,
Yep.
I think is a huge step in the community. So we're doing some things like that. We're trying to move methodically but quickly. And you and I have had conversations offline where I've said, I think I said to you once, hey, everybody just needs to breathe a little bit. But you said, yeah, Paul, but we don't need to just breathe because the momentum is happening.
Right.
Change is being asked for now. So I get it. I get the desire that you want just to have everyone just chill.
Yeah.
But chill is not how action will happen for
Right.
us. And so I understand that. And so we're trying to do some of those things on a more expedited basis. And getting government to move quickly is never real easy.
I've never seen government
Yeah, me neither.
No, I appreciate those initiatives. Those are big action items that really would allow Sioux Falls and the Black community in particular to take steps forward. One of the questions that has been asked to me a lot, and I'll bring it to you as well, is have you seen any issues within our police department to where there has been some racial inequity or even a racial divide between the police department and the Black community?
Well, I was watching the news this morning before I came in here, and they were talking about settlements that police departments have had to pay out for issues of discrimination or excessive use of force. And they showed New York City, and they paid out over $1 billion in settlements since 2015. So in 5 years, that has cost the taxpayers $1 billion because of misaction, inappropriate action by their PD. During my time in office, in 2 years, we paid out zero. I mean, we've never had any of those claims. So I'm not saying they don't exist.
Sure.
I'm saying when they're reported, they're investigated, and people have the opportunity to pursue legal action if they're egregious enough. We haven't had those. I'm not sticking my head in the sand, though, and saying they don't exist. We're not having claims. We don't have a problem. What I am saying is our community needs to know that they have the right, and the ability to ask for change if they feel that they have been mistreated by law enforcement, mistreated by the mayor, mistreated by anyone in government. They need to share that. They need to come forward with that. They need to make their voice heard in that, because there is an investigation process that we do. So while I'm saying we haven't had many cases of that, Julian, in our community, which is also, to my earlier point, why we started a good point to make change here.
Right.
Because we don't have a lot of crap to cut through. We started a point of somewhat positivity, and we can build on that already.
Absolutely. And I say all the time, Sioux Falls is in the perfect position to do things the right way and set the example, set the standard nationally for other cities to follow. I appreciate that. Those are the easy questions. So I'm gonna get into a couple maybe more difficult questions here for you. There are some policy gaps around the country that have been highlighted from some of these things. What are some of the policy gaps that either you or your administration have recognized as being a hindrance to the progress of people of color in Sioux Falls?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Specifically with policy, one of them I highlighted earlier. We didn't really have a policy around diversity numbers we wanted to see in law enforcement. Okay. We just said it'd be nice to have a diverse law enforcement, but we haven't really had a policy. Well, now we're putting a flag in the sand and saying, okay, we're setting a goal of this. While it's still not quote unquote policy, we're putting it out there. So now we're held accountable to it. And it's one thing to just say something internally. When you share goals and you share policies externally, now you have to be held accountable to performing in that. There's a few things that I'm starting to look at in terms of, we've talked about this, having a commission or a policy review board or a citizen policy review board that not only works with law enforcement, but all of the city policies, housing policies, things like that, to ensure that the policies overall in the city are fair and equitable to people of color, people of different sexual orientations, all those things, so that there's no discrimination happening. So a lot of times we go right to law enforcement right now because that's the topic, but there's a lot of other issues within the city that also affect people. And so a citizen policy review board is something that we're looking at potentially setting up that would actually have some clout. And it's one thing to say, well, this board is just a rubber stamp for the administration. No, I want this board to have a level of authority and clout in the community that if they feel there's discrimination happening in someone's workforce, with the housing issue, with PD, with the mayor, they can take it to this board, and this board will actually have a bully pulpit to help address that in the community. So I think that's one of the checks and balances that I think we're maybe missing right now in the city. We have what's called the Human Relations Commission, which deals specifically with housing mostly. But housing is just one slice of the potential kind of inequity pie that we need to look at. Wage inequality, some of those things, which I think we're going to maybe even talk about, are other issues that I think this policy review board could potentially help us with.
Awesome. I think also that brings a level of accountability, and that's one of the things that I've heard a lot from the black community is that, one of the things that we really want, not just from the police department, but from our elected officials, is just a certain level of accountability. And so putting those initiatives and those policies in place, I think, really brings a level of accountability. So I personally
we have that.
appreciate
I'll say one other thing on that. We have, for instance, a Parks Board. We have a Planning Commission. Those have a lot of authority in the city. So our city council will say, where's the Planning Commission at on this? And has the Planning Commission reviewed this? And if the Planning Commission has reviewed a zoning change, for instance, and approved it, the city council will say, okay, I feel confident because the planning commission agreed. I think we need the same thing, the same level of authority with a board like this to say, has the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Board reviewed this? Oh, they have? Okay.
Right.
Then that gives a stamp of approval to us as elected leaders.
Yeah, awesome. All right, with Juneteenth signifying the freedom of slaves, it also came with the promise of reparations. Now, although reparations is more of a federal conversation, it does bring up questions of equity. So with that said, what changes would you like to see during your tenure as mayor in order to make Sioux Falls a more equitable community for Black people?
Another great question. And I'll tell you one thing I would like to see is more people of color in leadership positions in this city. And I look at our city council, okay, of which, you thrown your hat in the ring for a position there. I look at my own leadership team. I look at our Chamber of Commerce. I look at our Development Foundation. It's a pretty homogenous group of leaders in this city right now. But what I'm seeing is a tsunami of diversity coming in the community. So, 60-some% of our school district is white, and 30-some% is non-white.
Right.
But overall in the city, we're more like 80-20. So the diversity right now that we're really seeing is coming up in our school district, and that's going to be coming into our community. So we need to start understanding, how do we create leadership development opportunities for people of color? I think of the leadership series that Vonnie and Tamian have put together in Leaders of Tomorrow. It's a very diverse leadership group, helping develop the next generation of leaders, many of which are of diverse backgrounds. That's, I think, a focus that we need to do in the city of Sioux Falls. We have a program called Leadership Sioux Falls in the city. Again, it's a pretty homogenous group that we usually have that goes through that. How do we make sure that program, some of those programs, are representative of what the Sioux Falls of 2030 is going to look like? Absolutely.
One of the other programs is the Sioux 52 program. And I know we've talked about that, offline as well. It's an incredible program for those who are in need of mentors, and I know we're looking for mentors. That's a shameless plug. We're looking for mentors.
We are looking for mentors.
However, the greatest hurdle in the Black community has not been mentorship. It's been overcoming the wealth gap. So, historically and currently, we know that the wealth gap between white families and Black families is right around $247,000. $247,000. What are your plans to ensure that there is diversity in the workplace, in boardrooms, in education, law enforcement? We kind of talked on law enforcement, but also business ownership in the community.
Yeah. Man, these are good questions, and they're longer discussions than we can have here. But I think one of the roles that I have as mayor is to ensure that we're bringing job opportunities to the city that provide a livable wage and provide a working wage. And we, right now in South Dakota, we rank near the top of all 50 states in terms of people who work 2 jobs in a single household. And sometimes people will spin that and say, well, it's because we're a hard-working community. We're Midwest.
Right.
But I think a lot of times the reality is you have to make ends meet. You work $11 an hour as a server here, that isn't going to pay for your apartment. You got to have another gig, a side gig over here to make ends meet. So the private sector dictates their wages, and people will work for whatever their employer will pay them, and if they don't, they leave and go somewhere else. So some of that happens on its own within the private sector. But we also, as the city, need to, when employers are looking at moving to Sioux Falls, I'm having several economic development discussions with big companies that are looking to relocate Sioux Falls right now. My first question is always, what are the jobs and what do they pay? Because we don't want 500 jobs at $13 an hour.
For sure.
Because that just creates housing problems, wage gap problems, food security problems. We want 500 jobs at $18 to $25 an hour, where people can work one job on a livable wage and be somewhat secure in their income level. So that's a conversation we continue to have, and continue to just push the private sector to say, listen, your employees need to be paid a livable wage. Housing is a big issue. Affordable, accessible housing is an issue, and a lot of employers do that, know that. But I say to them, listen, if your employees are having housing problems and you can't retain them because they can't afford housing, you also have to look at what's your role in that solution in terms of what you're paying that employee. And maybe some of it falls back onto you as the employer as well.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I got one last question here for you, and this is an easier question for you. How do you and your family plan on celebrating Juneteenth this year?
Well, I'd like to get out to an event, and what I did this morning, it was funny because I was watching the news with my daughter, who's 14, and she saw that there was a story on Juneteenth being moved, a rally that the president was having, moving it from Juneteenth to the next day, and she asked, what was this about? 14-year-old girl didn't know what it was about. So my encouragement to people in our community is to use that day to just educate your family and people around you on what that is. I used this morning to talk about it with my daughter, who didn't know what Juneteenth was. Yeah. And I would dare bet 80% of this community doesn't know that. Right. So in addition to potentially going out and celebrating it at an actual event, use it to educate yourself and your family on what that event means and why it's so important to people of color in Sioux Falls. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for joining us for this conversation. We hope to have many more.
I'd love it.
Yeah. So, and thank you guys for watching. Next year, make sure you join us for our Juneteenth celebration. We hope to have that one in person. Otherwise, stay tuned for some more virtual events online through Establishing Sustainable Connections and on our other social media platforms.
I have with me today the Sioux Falls Mayor, Mr. Paul TenHaken. Thank you so much for participating and establishing Sustainable Connections, Juneteenth celebration. We wouldn't have it any other way without you being a part of it. You've been a part of it for many years, so thank you again for signing the proclamation for us. And I'll leave it in your hands.
My pleasure. I'm glad to read this. When I took office, one of the first acts I had to do, because this was June 19, and I took office May 15, was do this. And I'll be honest, I was a little uneducated about Juneteenth. And I think there's a lot of people in the country now who are much more educated on what Juneteenth is, what it represents. And so for the third year in a row, I get a chance to read a proclamation from the city of Sioux Falls, from my office. And it goes like this. Whereas Juneteenth is the celebration of the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued by U.S. President Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863. The proclamation gave the Southern slaves their freedom and is considered an important benchmark in the African American struggle for freedom and equality. Whereas the word Juneteenth comes from the words June and 19th, which, according to Southern folklore, is when the slaves of Texas first learned of their freedom. Though technically freed in 1863, the slaves did not learn of their freedom until the arrival of the Union soldiers on June 19, 1865. This was after the end of the Civil War and 2.5 years after the proclamation was first issued. Whereas the Emancipation Proclamation is considered the catalyst that ended slavery. But at the time the proclamation was issued, it really did not free anyone, since the Confederate States did not recognize President Lincoln's authority. It was not until the Civil War ended that the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1865, officially outlawed slavery. Whereas Juneteenth began as a celebration by ex-slaves and has continued to be widely celebrated across the U.S. Now therefore, this is a long one.
Yes.
I, Paul TenHaken, Mayor of the City of Sioux Falls, do hereby proclaim June 19, 2020 as Juneteenth 2020 in our great city. So thank you, Harriet. Can we shake hands?
We can.
Okay. We got hand sanitizer.
Wonderful.
I hope it's a great event.